Okay, Unit 2 deals with the institutions of government, and the institutions of government are the main things that really hold up our government. And so Chapter 9 deals with the Congress, Chapter 10 deals with the presidency, Chapter 11 deals with the bureaucracy, and Chapter 12 deals with the judiciary. And these are going to be really the four institutions that hold up our nation's government. So they're going to be the three branches of Congress as well as the bureaucracy, which is really, for the most part, an extension of Congress and the presidency. And so today, in this lecture and in the second part, we're going to be looking at the Congress. So Congress's main job is representation. They're supposed to represent the people. Each congressman or woman has a constituency, which are the residents in an area where an official is elected. And the representation of their constituency is the primary responsibility of these individuals who have been elected. Political scientist David Mayhew suggested that congressmen and women and senators are single-minded seekers of re-election. And so everything that they do can be traced back to their goal of being reelected. And so if this is true, it is theoretical in nature. So if this is true, then they must be beholden to their constituents, or how else would they be reelected? And so that's just kind of something to think about. Are our congressmen and women beholden to the people? Or are they beholden to other outside factors? Whatever the case, their job is supposed to be representing their constituencies, representing their people. Now, as we talked about the development of the Constitution in our last unit of study, we talked about the fact that the legislature in the United States is bicameral, meaning it has two chambers. And so representation in the House is a little bit different than representation in the Senate. They both have the job of representing people, but it looks a little bit different depending on the chamber that you were looking at. And so if we look at the House of Representatives, the House of Representatives is much larger. They have 435 members in the House of Representatives. And because of that great compromise with the founding, this chamber of the legislative branch is apportioned according to population. So the more people you have within your state, the more seats in the House of Representatives you get. And this is decided after the census is taken every 10 years. If your population grows in a state, then you're going to have more seats added to your state delegation. If your population shrinks or stays stagnant, you might have to have one seat taken away from your state. And so there's a finite pot. There's 435 seats. They're going to be apportioned out to the 50 states according to population. So the larger states, the larger in population, that is, are going to receive the most of the seats. And so if we were to look at Texas, I believe Texas has 38 seats in the House of Representatives. That's a very large number. But if you look at other places, interestingly enough, Alaska, the largest state in the nation in regards to land area, they only have 3. And every state is guaranteed at least 1, right? And so if we look at, excuse me, I think Alaska really only has 1, now that I think about it. Every state is guaranteed at least 1 because that's just, I mean, you're guaranteed at least that many. And each member of the House of Representatives represents about 750 to 800,000 people. So it's a very large number. They run for re-election every 2 years. Every seat, all 435 seats in the House of Representatives, is up for re-election every 2 years. So they are constantly running for re-election. And so because they are constantly running for re-election, if we think back to David Mayhew's idea that congressmen and women are single-minded seekers of reelection, these people must be attuned to the legislative needs and local interest groups. They're going to have to really understand what it is that their constituents want and what the local interest groups are sort of pushing for. And so typically they will have very specific legislative agendas because they can focus specifically on one area of their state. So Texas is divided up into 38 different congressional districts. The congressional district here in, say, Midland County only has to look at this particular area of the state. He doesn't have to care about what's going on in Dallas. He doesn't really have to care about what's going on in Houston. He has to really pay attention to the needs of the people, out in West Texas. And if you're familiar with West Texas, that's going to be oil and agriculture. And so they can be very, very focused. And so if we have a member of the House of Representatives who is, very powerful on, the agricultural committee or on energy or something of that nature, it's going to be very good for us out here in West Texas. So they have very specific legislative agendas. And they're very interested in doing what their constituents want done now, in real time, instant gratification, because they need that to seek re-election in 2 years. They need to be able to point to something that they have done to benefit the people in their constituencies over the past 2 years so that they can be re-elected. But if we flip to the Senate, there are only 100 senators, and that means there are 2 from every state, no matter of the size of your state in regards to population or land area or anything like that. The Senate is really supposed to be the more deliberative body. They are elected to 6-year terms, so they're more insulated from electoral pressure because voters typically have a very short memory, and so if it happens, in the first year or 2 of a senator's term, then voters might forget about it when that 6-year mark rolls around, and so they are more insulated from electoral pressure. They are the more deliberative body, as I said. They have time to consider new ideas or bringing together coalitions to get something done. Senators are going to have a more broad legislative agenda because they represent an entire state and must be attuned to the needs of all constituents in the state instead of just one small group. So, whereas in the House it's divided up in Texas into 38 different congressional districts, because there are 38 people, and so 38 members of the House, in the Senate, there's only 2 for the entire state. And there's something like 29 million people in Texas. So 2 people are going to be representing all 29 million people. And Texas is a huge state. And so the wants and the needs of people in Amarillo might not be the same as what people want or need in Harlingen, which is about 14 hours. If you drive from the top of Texas down to the southern border, you're on the road about 14 hours. And so it's a very, very large state. So the Senate is much less worried about doing things in the here and the now. They're much less worried about that instant gratification that perhaps members of the House of Representatives are more concerned about, because they have longer terms, they're more deliberative, they have the ability to take their time. If we look at the constitutional requirements for the job, the Constitution does set out specific requirements that one must meet in order to run for one of these seats. So if you plan to run for the House of Representatives, you must have reached a minimum age of 25. You must have been a citizen for at least 7 years. Again, the length of your term will be 2 years. And you're going to be elected from your state in a specific from a specific area. California, which is the most populous state, has 53 members of the House. So it depends on your population. So you're much more localized. In the Senate, you must be at least 30 years old. You must have been a citizen for at least 9 years. Again, 6-year terms, and it's a two-person per state, so it's much more statewide and less localized. Now, there are a couple of different types of representation. The first type of representation is sociological representation. And this is the type of representation where representatives have the same race, gender, ethnicity, religious affiliation, educational background as constituents. And so when you are represented sociologically, you feel like the person is speaking on your behalf because you feel like you might be the same person. They understand who you are because you share an ethnicity or a religion or an educational background or a race or a gender or something like that. This type of representation promotes good representation, and the composition of a properly constituted assembly should mirror the composition of society. And so if we wanted to ensure fair representation, it would be done sociologically. And, it would mirror how society looks. It wouldn't just be a whole bunch of old white men elected to office, which is generally the case. And we're starting to see a lot of shifts in representation. If you look at the makeup of the current House of Representatives, there are many more women. There are some religious minorities like Muslims who are in this current House of Representatives. There are younger people. And so sociological representation is really changing, but it's not something that's been has varied much in society. Most of the time, the people that have been elected over the course of the American history are old white men. And you might add to that wealthy. Then there's agency representation. And this representation takes place when constituents have the power to hire and fire their representatives. So even if you are being represented by somebody you do not sociologically connect with, they are not of your same ethnicity, they are not of your same religion, they are not of your same educational background or your race or your gender, that you still feel like you're being represented and they're speaking on your behalf because you have the ability to decide whether or not they keep their job. And I would dare say that many people probably fit into the agency representation more than sociological representation within society, because old white men typically are the ones that have represented us throughout American history, and we're not old white men. In fact, I don't think any of us in this class are old white men. But this type of representation allows individuals with different backgrounds from the representative to feel like the representative is actually speaking on their behalf, because they feel like they can hire or fire them by voting. I can re-elect them if I need to, or I can fire them and not elect them if I need to. So agency representation is very powerful as well. There are some factors that affect the election of representatives. These things can be very significant in who is elected and the makeup of the legislature. And the first thing is incumbency. And incumbency is holding a political office for which one is running. So you are already elected to office, you're running for re-election. You are the incumbent. Once in office, members have access to a lot of tools that stack the deck in their favor. One of those tools is something called constituency services, meaning this is how they help the people with government-related issues. If you have the power to intervene on behalf of a constituent who is having problems with a government agency, that's a very powerful thing to have. If you get in touch with your representative and say, hey, I'm having problems with the Social Security office or the Veterans Affairs office or with passports, could you step in on my behalf and help me? And that representative makes a call to that particular government agency and gets something done for you, you're going to feel like they're working on your behalf. And you're going to feel like, hey, they scratched my back, I'll scratch theirs by voting for them in the next election. And so this is very, very powerful. And the person who is running against the incumbent, they don't have the ability. They can call Social Security office and try to lodge a complaint on your behalf. But if you're not an elected member of the Congress, the weight behind your complaint or how you're intervening is not very significant. And so incumbents really seek to establish personal relationships with the voters within their congressional districts, and this helps them a lot. And we see very, very high reelection rates. Sometimes reelection rates have been as high as 98% for House members and 90% for senators. And so incumbency sort of helps to scare off challengers sometimes. Sometimes somebody won't run against an incumbent because that incumbent has been in office for so long, they're powerful, and they may be a little intimidated to run against them. And so it can really help to propel that incumbency rate. The incumbency advantage tends to promote what is known as the status quo in Washington, meaning, not changing what's already being done. And so when you don't change the status quo, it really makes it harder for women and minority groups to be elected and to participate in the process. And so this is an argument for term limits that really stem from incumbency advantage. We want to get new faces in Washington. We want to get these people who have served in Congress for 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 years out and get some new faces in. And the only way to really battle this incumbency advantage might be to institute term limits. And so that's really an argument for term limits. Apportionment is another factor that affects elections, and apportionment is the process of allocating congressional seats among the 50 states, and we've sort of alluded to this already in our lecture. It's a major factor that affects who wins elections. Every 10 years after the federal census, the state legislatures are given the power to redistrict their estates according to new data. And so we have 435 members in the House of Representatives. After that census every 10 years, they put all 435 members into a pot and they decide, okay, Texas has grown by this much. That means they're going to get 2 or 3 more seats. And so instead of having 38 seats, now you have 40. So now you need to break up your state into 40 congressional districts. That means we're going to get 2 new representatives from our state in Congress. By, the same token, on the flip side, if you're shrinking, we'll say maybe South Dakota is shrinking, their population is not growing, and so we're going to have to take away 2 seats from them because their population is getting smaller and smaller. And so apportionment can really have an effect on who wins, because when the state legislatures redraw these districts, they sometimes do it in a way that is maybe not necessarily on the up and up. They have to divide up the state according to new numbers, and it's about 800,000 to 1 representatives. And sometimes they draw districts that are gerrymandered. And gerrymandering is the manipulation of electoral districts to serve the interest of a particular group, right? And so if, as in Texas, the state legislature is controlled by Republicans and they're given the power to redistrict these states, to divide the states up into these congressional districts, they might do it in such a way that it's more beneficial to Republicans than it is to Democrats. But there's a couple of other different types of gerrymandering as well. There's racial gerrymandering, which is the manipulation of electoral districts to allow for minorities to be better represented. So we bring in that sociological representation, okay? There's actually been a Supreme Court case called Miller versus Johnson in 1995 that sort of allowed for racial gerrymandering. The Supreme Court ruled that race cannot be the predominant factor for creating districts. Now, it can be a factor, right? If a large percentage, 90% of the people in one particular area of the state that's going to be put into a congressional district are African Americans, it stands to reason that an African American should be, a person who is elected to represent those people. And so they might put them into one congressional district and allow, sociological representation to take place. Remember, where this representative understands who I am, so they're speaking on my behalf. So this Miller versus Johnson Supreme Court ruling said it can't be race can't be the predominant factor for creating districts, but it's up for debate as to what predominant means, because predominant can be a very fluid, very nebulous, it's open for interpretation. So the Supreme Court kind of said, yeah, you really shouldn't do this, but you can, right? But then there's also political gerrymandering, which I talked about, is drawing districts to allow one political party to be successful over another. Another factor that will affect the election of representatives is patronage. And patronage is providing direct benefits to constituents. And the biggest way we see patronage take effect is what is known as pork barrel legislation, or sometimes just referred to as pork. And pork barrel legislation is appropriations made for local projects. Often they are not needed, but they help local representatives to get reelected. And so there might be a bill that's passed and a $50 million earmark might be put in that bill that brings a research laboratory into my congressional district. Well, when that's built in my congressional district, it's going to employ people to build it. It's going to employ people to work in it. It's going to provide jobs. It's going to make money. And so it's going to look like the guy who is elected out of our district is actually doing something for us. And so, hey, if he can bring home the bacon, then he can, have his job back. He can get reelected. And so it's seen as extremely important to members' reelection bids. Actual tangible results brought to the district by representatives are very important. Things like projects, bridges, roads, special benefits. And the easiest way, and there has been sort of a moratorium on pork barrel legislation over the past, 10 years or so. But in the easiest way to get pieces of pork barrel legislation through Congress is to attach them as amendments to different pieces of legislation. And one example of this is the 2005 Highway Bill. In the 2005 Highway Bill, 6,000 projects were earmarked for special spending in districts, and the most well-known earmark was, quote, the Bridge to Nowhere. This was nearly a $400 million earmark for a bridge connecting the town of Ketchikan, Alaska, population 8,000, to Gravina Island, which had Ketchikan's airport and 50 residents. So they wanted to build a $400 million bridge to connect a small island with 50 residents and an airport to another small town of 8,000 people. They already had a method of getting to this island. It was a 5-minute ferry ride that charged $6 round trip for individuals and $7 for automobiles. But Senator Ted Stevens, who was a scion of Alaskan politics for a very long time, on the Senate floor threatened to quit Congress if he did not get this funding. As it turns out, he didn't, and he would later become narrowly defeated in the 2008 election after being convicted of corruption on other charges. And so when the 2008 election came around and John McCain chose Alaska Governor Sarah Palin as his running mate, this actually became a national issue. It shouldn't really have been on such a huge grand scale, but because the governor of Alaska became the running mate for the presidency, it became a huge deal. And so a lot of attention was brought to it, and the House began to regulate earmarks by requiring that all members of Congress supporting an earmark identify themselves and guarantee that they had no personal financial stake in requesting the project. And this is very similar in the Senate as well. In 2011, the Senate and the House agreed to a 2-year moratorium on earmarks and spending bills, but few members support making it permanent. Some analysts claim that it actually leads to gridlock because there is no incentive for people to compromise. And so, because there is no way for people to compromise back and forth, saying, hey, if you support this, project for my constituency, I'll support this one for yours. It's actually led to gridlock because there's nothing that really brings people of opposing views together. There's no bargaining chips. And so, there's might be some benefits of having pork barrel legislation, but it obviously can go over the top. And then there are private bills that assist in electing representatives, and patronage is private bills are part of patronage, and this is providing relief for particular individuals. And a lot of the times this deals with immigration, providing a workaround for individuals seeking residency, even though the immigration quota has been maxed out for their specific country. So it's just working for a particular person on a very, very small scale. Now, I know it's getting, I know I promised to try to keep these at 20 minutes, but if you'll just bear with me, we'll get through the next couple of slides, and then I'll break and I'll do the next lecture on Congress in another video. That way it does break it up a little bit. All right, so we looked at the factors affecting Congress. Now let's look at the organization of Congress. The leadership in Congress is decided by each political party. The Democratic Party have what's called the Democratic Caucus, and the Republican Party has what's called the Republican Conference. And they will get together and elect their leaders from within their own party. So all the Democrats elected will come together in their caucus, and they will decide who their leaders in Congress will be. All the Republicans who are elected in Congress in the House of Representatives will come together, they'll conference, and they'll decide who their leaders are going to be. And so in the House of Representatives, there are several different offices that are significant. The first is the Speaker of the House. And leader names will be submitted by each one of the political parties, and then they will be submitted to the entire House of Representatives as a whole, and there will be an entire House vote on who will become the Speaker. Now, obviously, if you are the Democrat and your political party, as with the current Congress, if you have the majority in Congress as the Democrats, and your name is put forth as the leader of your party, and it goes to a whole House vote, you have the majority, you will become the Speaker of the House. But it is something that occurs, it is a kind of a formality. The next office is the Majority Leader, and they are the next in command. They are subordinate to the Speaker of the House. They're kind of like the Speaker's right-hand man or woman. And then the Minority Leader. And the Minority Leader is obviously the leader of the minority party, and they lead the opposition to that majority. So in this last congressional organization, after the 2018 elections, the Democrats won the majority in the House of Representatives. They came together, they submitted Nancy Pelosi as the Democratic leader name, and they submitted Kevin McCarthy as the Republican leader's name. Those two names went to a vote, and the entire House voted to have Nancy Pelosi as the Democratic Speaker of the House. She names a majority leader, and then Kevin McCarthy, because he did not win the speakership, he sort of de facto became the minority leader in the House of Representatives. And then you have whips, and the whips' jobs are to coordinate the party's legislative strategy, build support for key issues, and wrangle votes. So, quote, to whip up the votes or to whip um, the members into line. Okay. And then there's also what's called the Steering and Policy Committee, which assigns new legislators to committees and deals with requests from incumbents to be transferred from one committee to another. And this is a very powerful position to hold. And so if you are on that committee in the House of Representatives, they are highly sought after positions on that particular committee. In the Senate, things are a little bit different. You have the President pro tempore of the Senate, sometimes just referred to as the President pro tem. The President pro tem is the longest serving member of the Senate in the majority party. Okay? And President pro tempore means president for the time being. It's a very ritualistic, doesn't have any power really. According to the Constitution of the United States, the Vice President is constitutionally the presiding officer of the Senate. But they are not allowed to vote unless there's a tie. And so their job in the Senate is extremely boring. There's nothing that they can really do unless there is a tie. And so oftentimes the vice president doesn't even come to the chamber unless there is a tie and he has to cast a tie-breaking vote. And so he doesn't really do anything. He's doing other things for the president. And so the person who is sort of the de facto leader of the Senate is the president pro tempore. And as I said, it is the longest serving member of the Senate in the majority party. It's a ceremonial role. It doesn't have a whole lot of power. It's just, kind of one of those figurehead things. The real power lies with the majority and the minority leaders, and they are chosen by their respective caucuses, and they set the calendar and they set the legislative agenda for bills that will be moving forward in that particular legislative session. And so if we look here, we have the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi. She is a Democrat from California. Then you have the Majority Leader, the Democratic Majority Leader, Steny Hoyer. He is a Democrat from Maryland. And then you have the Minority Leader, Kevin McCarthy of the Republican Party from California. And so in 2020, when there's another election, and all 435 seats are up for re-election, if the Democrats don't hold on to the majority, Nancy Pelosi will no longer be the Speaker of the House. It will likely be Kevin McCarthy who will take on that position. In the Senate, the Vice President from Indiana, Mike Pence, he is the official guy, the official ceremonial constitutional guy that is supposed to preside over the Senate because he has other things to do. The President pro tempore, which is Chuck Grassley from Iowa, he is the ceremonial head of the Senate. And then you have Mitch McConnell, he's the Republican Majority Leader from Kentucky. And the Chuck Schumer, who is the Democratic Minority Leader from New York. And so in our Congress, you have two branches, you have two chambers, the House of Representatives, which is currently controlled by Democrats, and the Senate, which is currently controlled by Republicans. So we have a divided legislature right now. All right, we're going to stop there. When we come back, we're going to talk about the committee system. In the Senate, we're going to talk about the staffing. We're going to look at how a bill becomes a law. And we're going to look at some of the things that affect congressional decisions. I try to keep these as brief as possible, but man, they just have so much information. So I apologize. I wanted to keep it at 20 minutes. I know we went over that. I would like to promise you that I'll do better in the next lectures, but I can't guarantee anything. So I'll see you in the next lecture.